The federal government announced a 2-year cap on international student permits this week. The policy will see a 35% reduction in the number of undergraduate study permits approved for 2024. It's part of Ottawa's response to the national housing crisis. And Immigration Minister Mark Miller says the main goal of the cap is to target what could be hundreds of institutional bad actors that are exploiting international students.
The ecosystem that's been created that's been very, very lucrative, where people pay 4 or 5 times what a domestic student would pay. And no one's immune from that, the largest institutions in Canada to the smallest.
I think there's going to be a lot of financial pressure on institutions, not just mine, with these changes that have come in today. That being said, we do support these changes. We do support his increase in funding that students must come to the country with. We think these are important actions that must be taken.
Sarom Rho is the national coordinator for Migrant Students United under the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, and she joins us now. Sarom Rho, it's nice to meet you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So this announcement on Monday, the 2-year cap and a reduction in student permits. Mark Miller, the minister who announced it, says some provinces could see a 50% reduction in the number of study permits they might get. I mean, what's your sense of what this will mean?
Yes, I mean, we're hearing there are caps, right? And I think some of the key questions we have to ask are who is being capped and what is being capped, because it's not the institutions that are being capped, it's the students and their families. So hidden in this announcement is that college and undergraduate level students will be barred effectively from bringing their families in. This is family separation, and it's not right. Minister Miller has also banned postgraduate work permits for international students who are going to be studying at public-private partnership educational institutions starting this September. So again, it's not banning the institutions who are doing wrong and who may be exploiting students, but it's actually punishing the students themselves. And so this doesn't really fix the failures of a massive expansion of these get-rich institutions, right? Which will continue.
Right, and you make a good point there, and I guess part of the problem from the federal government's perspective is that it's the provinces who have to deal with that end of the thing, that end of the problem, because they regulate post-secondary education. So on that, this is, Miller says this is part of Ottawa's way to target, and in his words, hopefully shut down some of these illegitimate private schools. How widespread do you think this taking advantage of international students by these institutions is?
I think that there is, we have to look at, not the so-called runaway numbers, but the runaway exploitation and profiteering that an unchecked temporary migration system has allowed to facilitate, right? And so the number one way to ensure the protections and rights for vulnerable migrants and international students is simply to ensure that they're treated like everybody else. And that means that they have to have the same rights and protections as all of us, whether it's to speak up against institutions who do wrong, or landlords or employers who mistreat them. And the only way that's possible is by ensuring they have permanent resident status for all. And minimally, with this announcement, we need 3 things. 1, for families not to be separated. 2, for those who are already in the country or who have applied for a study permit to be grandfathered in. And 3, a single system, right? There must be a single system in which schools that are eligible for study permits should also be eligible for postgraduate work permits. If a school is simply not good enough for a postgraduate work permit, then it should be closed down.
Is that your sense on where they intend this to go? Because the minister was talking about how they want to work with the provinces to develop sort of a preferred institution list and a standard. So it sounds like they are going to try to marry these permits with a credible list of institutions rather than making it really widely available. Is that your sense of where they're going to go with this?
I mean, the federal government has said on Monday that they've already worked with provinces and territories to establish numbers in what the decrease is going to look like, but institutions haven't yet heard how they are going to be able to continue to operate, right, when there has been such privatization of post-secondary education in most provinces across Canada. I mean, I think Ontario is looking at a 50% increase in international students, and at the same time, there is a massive housing crisis that's unfolding. I think people across Canada, not just international students, but working class people across Canada are being squeezed by an affordability crisis. But the reality is that just like you and me, international students are struggling, right? They're struggling to pay their tuition fees. They're struggling to pay rent. They're struggling to even afford basic groceries, and yet they don't have the power to speak up. And right now, without they are being essentially scapegoated for the housing crisis, right? The CAP's announcement is coming at the heels of a lot of conversation about the housing crisis. But international students and migrants are not to blame. It's the people who are seeking profit who are responsible for the shared crisis that we're all experiencing.
Right, and I think the government accepts that point, but I guess if you look at the stunning growth in the number of people who are being let in and the number of people who are being accepted by institutions, do you accept the argument that that's just not a sustainable level of inflow of students, regardless of where they're going? So, I mean, we've seen, the housing issue you talked about. We've also seen international students, having to rely on food banks because of high tuition costs and low incomes. Do you accept that the number did need to at least slow down?
I think the issue is not in the numbers, but in the denial of rights of international students and the exploitation and exclusion of them from this larger family of rights. For example, I think many people know that international student tuition fees are 3 to 4 times the domestic rate. So in Ontario, tuition fees average $45,000 for university students. And that's not even in addition to the $20,000 that many have to put in a trust in order to come here, right? And at the same time, institutions are able to spike international tuition fees without any caps. The domestic rate is capped at 2%, but international student fees can cap at any point, right? And so it's not that the students that there are too many, it's that they're here without rights and without being able to speak up when they are not treated fairly.
Right. So, Sarom, what do you think happens with Canada as a destination for international students? Because as you talked about, they need to have more money, show that they have more money to be allowed to come here. There's restrictions on when they can work and how long they can work and whether they'll be able to work afterwards. Do you see applications going down? Do you see Canada not being a preferred destination for international scholars? What do you think might happen here?
I think that with the banning of postgraduate work permits at public-private educational institutions, what will happen is that recruiters and agents will be able to funnel vulnerable students to these institutions, many of whom may not know that they can't get a postgraduate work permit, or do know and will be then locked into even more exploitative conditions. And I don't think anybody in the country wants that. When one of us is being denied our rights, it hurts all of us. So this is really a moment where we see that the federal government is trying to address the crisis, but it's missing the mark. And so we need to be standing together and demanding equal rights and fairness for all. We also have seen that the federal government stopped building homes, right? A recent report by the CCPA showed that there has been a 36% decrease in homes. Everybody's been watching this play out for years, that there is a housing crisis in the making, and yet international students and migrants right now are being brought in and scapegoated, essentially. And it's both subsequent federal liberal and conservative governments that have allowed for financialization of the housing market and privatization and provincially privatization of public institutions. And I think people across the country want public education.
Sarom Rho, it was good to meet you. Thank you for your time. Sarom Rho is National Coordinator for Migrant Students United.